Here's what I know about the majority of most of us consider ourselves grateful people. Even those of us who others would go, no, you're not so much. We still would consider ourselves grateful people, right? And at some point in life, probably not lately, hopefully not lately, but for the majority of us who are over the age of 20, there was probably some portion of life, and probably most likely in the teens, when maybe you heard some of these words. Maybe you heard the word ungrateful. Maybe somebody said to you, you're just ungrateful. Or maybe you're unappreciative or unthankful or an ingrate or maybe entitled. In fact, maybe they put those last two together. Maybe somebody called you an entitled ingrate. Don't raise your hand, but just some of us have had that experience, right? Of where, however we responded didn't get the kind of response we expected. It got one of those words said at us. And again, it's something that normally happens. We say towards kids. We don't normally say it to other adults. We just say it behind other adults' backs, right? She's so ungrateful, right? And he's just so unappreciative of all the stuff we do around here. But here's the truth of the matter. Ingratitude is hard to see in ourselves simply because we don't see ourselves as ungrateful. In fact, if somebody was to say to us today, you are ungrateful, you are so ungrateful, here's what would happen to us. We would get defensive, right? And in fact, when we get defensive, here's what will happen when somebody says you're grateful, we kind of respond this way. We get defensive and we begin to rehearse our grateful thoughts and feelings and conclude that we're grateful because we have some grateful thoughts and feelings, right? I know some things that I'm grateful for, so you can't call me ungrateful. But it's a funny process how our brains work. Here's what happens. We have these feelings of gratitude, right? And I'm not saying they're not real feelings. They're real feelings. But these feelings, they make us actually think we're grateful, which convinces us that we are grateful. Do you see how this works? And so when somebody says, you're so ungrateful, we stop, and it's like when you're in that argument with your spouse or your significant other, and they say you always or you never, and you think of that one exception to that, which destroys their whole argument, right? Because they said, you said always, you can't say always, right? You say never, and I did it that one time, right? Like 1984, I think it was, right? And it's like, wait. So we push back when somebody comes at us and says we are ungrateful. And we push back because we think they're saying we don't feel something. In fact, we say to the question to ourselves, we said, how could they possibly know how we feel? How can you judge my feelings? But what if that's the point? They don't know how we really feel. They don't know how we feel, which means, but they do know how they feel. As I was getting ready for today, a thought popped in my mind that I hadn't thought about for quite a while. I remember as being a teenager, I was a great kid. My mother's here today. Right, Mom? Where's Mom? She's right there. Right, Mom? Yes is the answer. Thank you. All right, yes. Out of the two, I was the best. 50% is not bad, Mom. That's pretty good odds when you come out. But I remember as a kid distinctly one day, hearing my mother come home. I was upstairs. We lived in a 2-story house. I remember coming down the stairs. She was in the living room just taking off her shoes. And I remember I asked that question that so many teenage kids ask. You remember that question? How many of the rest of you ever asked this question, right? What's for dinner, right? Because I thought this was a question I had asked not only hundreds, but probably thousands of times by the time I was a teenager. To which my mother gave a very unmotherly response to me in that moment. And my mother had never done that before or after that. I don't remember all the words she used. I don't think she swore at me, but she used some words, right? And she kind of reminded me that I was being so ungrateful. I was not appreciative. And how could I ask her that after the long day? And I don't remember again all the words. I just remember, what sounded to her, it sounded to her ungrateful. It probably looked ungrateful, and it surely felt ungrateful to her for me to say, what's for dinner? And I wasn't intending for her to make it sound like it was ungrateful. But that was actually the problem. I didn't have any intention to it. See, what if unexpressed gratitude is experienced by others as ingratitude? No matter how good we feel inside, how positive we feel inside towards somebody else, if it stays inside, doesn't come out, it kind of looks and feels like something that we don't intend to feel. In fact, Jesus had this experience a couple thousand years ago. Luke will record it. Luke, the guy who was not an eyewitness to these stories, but was an investigative reporter, we would call him today. And he'd actually gone out and talked to people who had experienced these things, people who had heard secondhand stories. And he wrote down the part of the Bible we call the Gospel of Luke. These observations. And Luke includes some of the stories that, Matthew, Mark, and John include. But he also includes some other stories that none of them have. And this is one of those stories that only makes into Luke's version. And it's a story I want to tell you right up front. It's not a story designed to teach us anything. It's actually just a real story that happened. But in the process of it seeing happen, it can teach us some things. Here's where we pick it up in Luke chapter 17. And this is actually towards the getting close towards the end of Jesus' life. And while Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, this is probably his last trip to Jerusalem. So he's going there. It's going to be crazy and hectic. And ultimately, he's going to get arrested and crucified and die. And thankfully come back to life, right? So while Jesus on his way to Jerusalem, he's going through this area between Samaria and Galilee, this borderlands area, between the primarily Jewish Galilee, where Jesus and a lot of his closest followers were from, and Samaria, which is like those people, right? They're separates, they're related to Jews, but they have a whole different religious thing, some stuff that's shared, but they see each other as enemies. Maybe the best example, if you know anything about the Muslim faith, Shia and Sunni, right? These two sort of competing, bop their heads together kind of groups. That's what this was back then. So this is a weird area for Jesus to be. But again, he's trying to stay low-key out of the way because he knows what faces him in Jerusalem, and he's trying to keep it all quiet until he gets there. So Luke says that how we heard the story was as Jesus comes into this village, there's 10 guys there that have this skin disease, leprosy, who meet him there. And if you don't know much about leprosy, it's a pretty dramatic disease to get. It doesn't just cause deformations, it actually numbs people's feelings, right? So you could chop off a finger and not feel you chopped off a finger. You could lose a body part and not really feel it. And it just had this, it was a very feared disease because nobody wanted to get it because the implications not only what it did to you, physically, but what it did to you socially. People thought it was contagious, and so you had to keep a distance from somebody. If you had leprosy, it was your job to let them know you had leprosy and just to warn them so they didn't have to get too close so that you would not, they couldn't catch it from you. And leprosy got you kicked out of their and separated from society. In fact, when Jesus comes here, most likely this group of 10 guys are living in this, little makeshift village outside of the village where the lepers from this area lived, right? It was a place that family could go and drop off food and they could, get food. They could get enough to survive, but they couldn't be in the regular city. And so there's this group of guys who are there when Jesus and his guys come into the village. And Luke tells us that talking about the lepers, they stood at a distance because, again, that was what they were supposed to do, stand at a distance from them. And they shouted out to Jesus these words, Master, Jesus, Master, have mercy, have pity on us. So apparently they know something about Jesus. They've heard some stories about Jesus. And so they see him and they keep their social distance and they shout out to Jesus. And when Luke tells us, when Jesus sees them, Jesus not only says, he shouts back to them, because again, there's this distance. And he shouts this word, go. And I think when Jesus shouts, go, before he finishes his sentence, they hear just the word go. And they focus on that because they've heard that statement so many times in their life since they've gotten to leprosy. When you shout, leper, leper, be careful. Everybody says, go, get out of here, get out. And that's what they hear, go, get out of here. But Jesus thankfully didn't end at that spot with just saying go. In fact, he said, go and show yourselves to the priest. Implication is, you have to go to the priest to get cleared. You're asking for pity and mercy, and I'm going to provide a way for that, but you got to follow the rules. And the rules back then was if you're part of this Jewish culture and you had the skin disease, right? Again, they thought it was contagious. You had to go see a priest. I'm so thankful we don't live in Old Testament times because I don't want to be seeing your skin stuff, all right? But you had to come to somebody like me and say, okay, Mike, look at this, right? Does that look good to you? And I'm like, no, it doesn't look right. But I had to sign off and say, okay, you're clean, and you had to be quarantined for a certain period of time. Then you got your bill of cleanliness, and you could go back. You were restored to life, which was a huge, huge thing. And Jesus, as these guys are shouting for pity, for mercy, Jesus shouts back and says, go and show yourselves to the priest, knowing that if 10 of them go, that's going to overwhelm one priest. You need a bunch of priests to look at this. Because again, there's this whole long process. And then Luke tells us something incredible happened, that as the 10 men were going, and I want you to think about that for a second. As Jesus says, go and show yourself to the priest, that's all he says. He doesn't say anything about healing, doesn't say anything. He just by implication says, this is what I want you to do. And they go, they take off going, and they go not because it made sense, because it didn't make a lot of sense. Just the fact that he says go and something's gonna happen. But they go, I think, because Jesus wasn't just their last hope, he was their only hope. And what they do at this moment is a term that's been around Christianity for a long, long time. Sometimes in places like this, you'll hear this phrase, this idea of walking by faith. You ever heard that phrase, walking by faith? These people are walking by faith, or he walked by faith, or she walked by faith. And it's simply this idea that these people followed Jesus' direction before they knew the outcome. That we walk by faith that God will do, what he promised to do or what he said to do or what we hope he will do, right? We're just gonna believe and go about our business as if it's gonna happen. And that's what this group of 10 guys are experiencing. Jesus says, go show yourself to the priest, and they head off. And as they're going, something incredible happens. Luke tells us they were healed. They were cleansed. To which we're like, that's kind of an interesting story. But if we had been one of those 10 guys, this would not have been an interesting story. This would have been like amazing, right? This is like life-changing, because as they're going, at some point, we don't know if they got 10 feet or 100 yards or 5 miles into this trip. At some point, they notice. All of a sudden, they can feel the rocks underneath their bare feet that they couldn't feel before, right? And when one of them, reaches over to pat the other one on the shoulder and say, hey, do you feel that? He actually feels that, right? Which is incredible, because all their senses, all their nerve endings are shot. And I imagine this is a group of guys, so ladies, bear with me for a moment. I imagine these guys punching each other in shoulders, because that's what guys do, right? Knocking each other upside the head, because it feels so good. Even though it hurts, it feels good to actually feel something after so long not being able to feel anything. No pain, nothing good, nothing soft, none of that stuff. These guys are elated, because life has dramatically changed. Life has forever changed in this moment. It had forever changed whatever period of time before when they got this skin disease, and now it has changed dramatically again. But that's not the only twist of the story. That's kind of the great part of the story, but Luke tells us something else happened that really changes the whole trajectory of this story. Because if you've read much about Jesus and his healing of people, he heals lots of people. Sometimes he touches them. Sometimes he spits in some mud and makes some stuff and puts it on their eyes. Sometimes he says something to them. Sometimes he just sends a message that something has happened. So we know from the stories of Jesus that Jesus can heal all different kinds of ways. There's no set way that he heals. It happens in lots of different ways. And this particular time was simply for these guys to believe what he said and head out on their way, that go and see the priest with the implications of it. And as they go, something happens incredible. But here's the twist that Luke reminds us of. He says, when one of them saw that he was healed, after punching his buddies and being excited, hugging each other, jumping up and down, feeling all the stuff that they haven't felt for so long, he actually catches himself and turns around and heads back towards Jesus. Because something in him says, hey, I can't just enjoy this moment, and look forward to how it's going to change, and I'll be able to go see my family again, and life gets restored. He stops and thinks about the one who helped him get there. And so he goes back to Jesus, praising, as Luke says, praising God in a loud voice. So he is loud and proud. And when he gets back to Jesus, however long it's taken him to get back there, he comes to him and he bows down. He falls on his face at Jesus' feet. And he begins to thank him, right? Which again is an uncomfortable scene for us to think about, right? A grown man, especially somebody with leprosy. I don't know if their fingers have all popped back or if they're still left with their the amputations. I don't know. Luke doesn't tell us that. But the fact that here's this grown man down there crying at Jesus' feet, he is so overcome with joy. And then Luke adds something to the story that wasn't sort of part of the storytelling, but is just an aside that he had learned in his investigation. Because here's what he wrote next. Which ought to make us all go, right? Because this means it wasn't one of us, it was one of them. Whoever them is for us. Which adds a whole new twist to this, because these 10 guys, apparently at least one of them was one of those people, right? But again, they find themselves in hard spots, and sometimes hard spots brings us together to survive those spots. But the one that comes back is the one that, at least according to the 12 guys or Jesus, isn't one of the ones that should have come back. To which causes Jesus to ask an important question. And we're not told who he asked the question to. It seems like he just asked the crowd. It's not necessarily directed at the guy. It's just to the 12 guys, maybe. Jesus asked this question. Guys, help me out here. Weren't there 10? Weren't there 10 that were healed, 10 that were cleansed? Help me out. Am I missing this, guys? And they're like, no, that was 10, Jesus. So guys, here's the important question. Where's the other 9? To which they're all like, I don't know, Jesus. And then Jesus drops the bombshell to touch on the spot that they had all been thinking about. Is this foreigner, this person, the only one who came back to give glory to God? Is this person who you all look at as, less than out there, right? Believes the wrong things. That's the one that came back. He's the only one that comes back to glorify God? To which I think at this point the disciples are all kind of looking down at their feet, looking, because nobody wants to look at Jesus because they're afraid Jesus is going to ask them a specific question, right? They just want to blend in because, again, they're uncomfortable with this. Because they understand what Jesus is saying. And it's not a comforter thing. How come the people that we say are the closest to God aren't the ones coming back to thank the God who's healed them? It's one of those people that actually has responded to God's goodness in their life. So Luke tells us then Jesus looks down at the guy and he tells him stand up. Doesn't say he helps him. He just says stand up, right? Stand up and go your way. You came back, you thanked me. I'm good with that. Stand up and go your way. You were healed because you believed, or more literally, your faith has saved, your faith has healed you. Important thought before we go past this. How many of the guys were healed? 10, right? So when Jesus says to the one guy, your faith healed you, it doesn't mean the other guy's faith didn't heal them. But Jesus recognizes that something had been left on the table by the other 9. Something that didn't help close the circle, that this guy, this foreigner, one of those people came and closed the circle on that moment. Which takes us back to an observation from this guy we've been looking at, Mark Madsen, right? And it's not specifically to this text, but because he's not a Christian, he's not a follower of Jesus, but I think he's got some great insights. Notice this, he says, you strengthen gratitude through conscious practice. Right? The way to become more grateful is actually to be consistently and very conscious about that practice. But notice what he wrote next. You lose it through unconscious laziness. Which I thought's a pretty good summary of those other 9, right? It isn't that, they weren't thankful, they weren't thrilled, but unconsciously, they were lazier than the Samaritan guy. See, the reality is, we don't mean to be ungrateful. Our problem is we just don't mean not to be. And I'm going to ask you a question right now that's going to make some of you really uncomfortable. In fact, some of you are going to be like, Mike, how dare you say that about me? But it's Thanksgiving, so. Has entitled become our ordinary? When I say our, I mean our, right? All of us, right? Because it's easy to look at kids, because we always look at kids, say they're so entitled, right? But let's be honest, we all have a little bit of entitlement to us. And has it become our ordinary? Where we just expect stuff. In fact, if you're a kid, if you're college age or under, let me just talk directly for you for just a moment. Just us talking today, right? Let me talk about this idea, and I'm not saying you're entitled. Well, I am saying you're entitled, but I'm saying we're all entitled. So, listen, we don't express appreciation for some very specific reasons, right? But think about your parents. How often do you express appreciation to them? You think, we don't express appreciation. Here's why. Because it's mom's job to make dinner, right? I mean, she's the one that's making dinner, so what's for dinner, right? And dad is supposed to take me to practice. Why? Because that's what he's supposed to do, right? It's their job to help us with our homework. It's their job to provide for us, buy us clothes, shoes, etc., right? And the reason is because they're our parents. They have to. fact, kids, it's what you tell yourself sometimes when you get old enough, right? You begin to, your parents say, I love you, I want you to know I love you. At some point you go, yeah, but you kind of have to because you're my parents, right? If you've ever thought those kind of thoughts, listen to me for just a moment. They don't have to. Because there's a lot of parents that don't, sadly. What we forget is that everything our parents do for us is voluntary. Yeah, I thought I'd get one in here. So let me say one more thing to kids, and then I'm going to move to parents. So don't, kids, I'm going to get them too, right? Yeah, there we go. All right. So back to Mark Manson, right? He had an article, online article, Shut Up and Be Grateful. I loved it. Your parents may be smothering and obnoxious. Don't say yes. Don't point at them. Just don't nod your head. Just kind of give me the eye nod, right? Your parents may be smothering and obnoxious, but they do it because they care about you. And it's the only way they know how to show it. Be grateful you have people who love you, even if they don't show it in the way you wish they did. Yeah, somebody's thinking, man, I wish my kids were here today, right? But parents, I'm not gonna let you off the hook either, right? Because the reality is we don't express appreciation because taking out the trash is part of their chores, right? Part of their responsibilities. Keeping up their room, keeping their room clean is their job, right? In fact, it's the only job they have, and they do a terrible job at it, right? But we say to ourselves, we don't express appreciation because it's their responsibility. They're supposed to. But parents, let me ask you a question. What if we thank them for the things they're supposed to do? Is there any chance that thanking them might actually get them to do those things? Free tip today, baby. We forget sometimes because we expect things, because that's how things have been, that ought to be enough. But we all know how it is when we feel like we're not being appreciated. We're not being recognized, not for some great things we've done, just for the ordinary stuff we do, for the stuff we provide, the stuff we do. Back to Mark Manson again, I love this quote. Your ancestors survived centuries of floods, wars, famine, slavery, and plagues. For you to be able to sit on the toilet and compare your life to people on the internet you've never met. He's got one more line. We don't often think about that, right? But people went through a whole lot of stuff, right? In fact, you ought to go look at this article because he goes in depth about where we're at in history, and as much as we kind of are mad at some things, we're like at the best time for lots of things, even though it may not seem like it in the moment. In fact, later in this article, he writes, you've been blessed, even if you rarely realize it. All of us here have. And you'll keep forgetting this unless you remind yourself. Kind of that miracle, million little miracles we sang about before, right? Remind yourself regularly. Choose to be grateful. So here's the thought as we wind it kind of down for this part of things. What if we did grateful, not just felt grateful? What if we were able to move, the stuff we feel inside here and the stuff that we're stopped, the stuff that we wait for, 8th grade graduation or high school graduation or maybe college graduation, to say thank you to those people? What if that became a part of who we are just as people? What if we got better at being grateful out loud? And here's what I'm hoping will happen today. Before you leave this campus, I hope you'll go look for some people that maybe have served you, have treated you well, have done nice stuff to you, but maybe you haven't said thank you to, right? For those of you that maybe ever gone down to Poor Place or had a coffee, a chocolate, a tea, a milkshake, right? That you can stop and say thank you for what you do, right? For all the stuff they provide for you and for your kids, right? There's Maureen, she's the head of it. Make sure if you see her, thank her. But there's other ones. If you got any kids here, right? You know about our kids ministry and how important and valuable it is. Take a minute to find somebody that helps your kids get checked in, or maybe teaches your kids, or maybe who just touches the life of your kids. Because the reality is there are people, that we see. There's people we don't see, people who work behind the scenes on stuff. And there's people that are out front every week who greet us when we show up. And there's people who kind of watch and make sure they can find a place to sit here today, right? So Darren, thank you. Thank you. I love me some Darren. Darren, you don't know how valuable, how important he is to so much stuff that happens here. But lastly, for those of you that are part of New Hope, if you're here first time, this won't necessarily apply to you, so don't feel offended. But for those of you that are regularly part of New Hope, I got one other group I want to thank. You. Because you help make New Hope New Hope. And we pastors regularly talk about it, that we are privileged to be part of a church that lines up so well with us, that we feel we can be ourselves, that it's just such a good fit. And it's about the diversity and the mix and all the things that happen. So again, thank you for being you. One last quote. Mark Manson again, the opposite of happiness isn't unhappiness, even though that we think it is, right? The opposite of happiness isn't unhappiness, it's taking things for granted. Something to think about today.